Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. We got Brianna Joy Gray on. She's going to have an update for us on how the billionaire class did during the pandemic. I know you're going to be excited about that. We've got Alec McGillis on. He's talking about Amazon and their future, especially with the union vote that occurred in Bessemer. We were waiting for that counting to be completed. But we wanted to start with how the nation is feeling about our former president.
This is really interesting. You spotted this in the Washington Post. Let's put it up there on the screen. The Trump media era ends not with a wow, but with a whisper. So this is Philip Bump over there at the Washington Post. Some really interesting graphs, and we'll put up there on the screen as well. And what you can generally see, Krystal, is that the search traffic around Trump has returned to the era of before he was president, that the amount of chatter about him has dramatically dropped off. And yes, while CNN and everybody else wants to make it so that he is the major story of the day, they're simply just unable to do that a couple of months now into the Biden presidency. And the series of charts that they have within there really do tell us a story about politics, in general, just about how quickly somebody can be on the national stage and exit. I'm not underestimating Trump's power, and we're about to get to that in a little bit, but I do think it is pretty dramatic that on a national level, in terms of the conversation, how much of political polarization and negative polarization was driven by Trump, the man himself. We seem to have some pretty good evidence that he really was just this incredibly unique factor in being able to draw a ton of attention, draw a ton of polarization, and really just kind of drive everybody crazy for 5 straight years. And all of the data that we're seeing has just completely borne that out currently.
The biggest asset and greatest skill that Donald Trump ever had was making himself the center of the news.
That's right.
That he could drive a news cycle, especially back in 2016, that he could make everybody talk about the issues that he wanted to talk about. So immigration is the key example. Trade is another key example. No one was really having this discussion about trade until he, and I would say also Bernie Sanders, put that conversation at the center of politics. When I was at MSNBC, I wanted to cover TPP more, and I was told people just don't care about it, which obviously was wildly incorrect.
Prove that one wrong.
But that tells you just how sort of peripheral it was to the elite conversation that was going on. He was always able to drive the news cycle and put himself at the center of it. So of all the stats and all the information that we've taken in his post-presidency, these have got to be the numbers that should be the most troubling to him, because his ethos has always been attention is good, whether it's positive press or negative press. Even as the negative press drove him crazy and drove him to distraction and all of that, he still loved being at the center of attention. So when you look at the fact that cable news, not covering him that much, the minutes on cable news during which his face appeared have dropped down to levels of before he ran for the presidency. Same thing with the Google search traffic. So it's not just that the cable nets aren't putting him on. People aren't really by and large searching for him that much either.
That's a more important indicator, in my opinion, even than cable.
I totally agree.
Whether there is real organic interest in somebody or whether there's like a manufactured thing that's happening on the cable level, I think it's fascinating to think about. And actually on a political level is bearing out exactly what I thought was going to happen post-January 6th, which is that pre-January 6th, the Republican coalition were these like upwardly mobile, former Mitt Romney people who always voted Republican, the people who could afford the boats at the boat parades and are slightly more boorish because Trump is now the president. Those people were also existed in this like weird new coalition of all these downwardly mobile non-voters, typical or atypical voters who really only came out to vote for Trump and Trump alone. Some of these more Latino men, some of these younger black men. Again, all marginal, but you add it all up and you get to around 75 million. The problem post-January 6th, and especially with Stop the Steal, was that only basically 3/4 of the people who voted for Trump were willing to buy it. And you basically had to make it so that it wasn't about voting for Trump because of tax rates, or it wasn't voting about Trump because of whatever, any social issue in which you wanted to serve as a bulwark against the left. It was, well, now I have to believe in this bullshit claim that the election was stolen. And after January 6th, I have to basically be okay with what happened here and do all sorts of apologisms. The amount of people that is basically cleaving off from the Republican Party upper middle class whites, suburbanites, many people who are culturally conservative, and others, but who are just like, no, I've simply had enough. And especially with somebody like Joe Biden, who has very low temperature in terms of the culture war, they're just very willing to vote for that. And that has led to some pretty dramatic problems. But it shows you that it's very profitable in order to be the king of X million Americans and Republican Party, around 75%. Let's put this up there on the screen just to give you guys an example. Trump raised $85 million and has cash on hand going into the second quarter that he's going to use for his operation in the midterms to take on his enemies, people who voted for his impeachment, people who he says were not sufficiently loyal to him. So he is now king of an increasingly small kingdom. And what it is he used to be like an emperor, as in he was the king, but then there were these provinces where his authority was questionable, but he technically had the domain. And now those people are breakaway provinces. They're like, no, we're not having your stuff anymore. I know I'm getting deep in the metaphors here. But I think it's important to try and understand, which is that he has absolute allegiance amongst X% of the population, probably 35% of the population. That's a lot of people, millions, tens of millions of people. He's very powerful, kingmaker in the primary process itself. But outside of that, a lot of the country is tuning out. And that's actually his worst fear, because his greatest superpower, like you said, was driving everybody crazy and also creating negative polarization, giving people who hated him, really hated him, an excuse in order to vote for him. And a lot of that is just starting to go away.
So I think there's a few things that are going on. Excuse me. As you were saying, basically elites cut him off.
Yes.
After January 6th, first of all, they already got their corporate tax cuts.
Correct.
They already got tons of goodies from his government. There are conservative judges in place who are going to rule in favor of corporations ever expanding in perpetuity. They already got their goodies, and essentially after January 6th, they cut him off. You're not useful to us anymore. We're done here. And even the people who would cry about Trump, they were all getting rich while he was in office. They got everything that they wanted out of that guy. Even the media people, who made lots of money and made careers off of him, the louder that they protested, the more famous and the more money that they made. But essentially, listen, in this country, if you don't have elite backing, you don't have much.
You're dead.
I mean, you're dead. That was kind of the story with Parler that we covered here. Once elites decided to pull their backing, there's such a small group of people that really actually control what goes on in this country. When they decided they were done with Trump, they essentially disappeared him. And part of it, so that's number one, related to that is the fact that he doesn't have his Twitter account anymore. And that actually is a big deal.
Facebook, too.
It turns out that, and I think Twitter is the bigger deal, though, because that's where elites are. So the fact that he puts on a press release on the side or does whatever he's doing from Mar-a-Lago, it just doesn't get injected into the bloodstream of elite media conversation the same way that it did when it was on Twitter.
Yeah.
It's not the same deal. And so, look, as you know, from a principled perspective, did not think that was the right move from Twitter. I think it sets a very terrible precedent that everyone should be uncomfortable with. But the practical outcome is that it actually is really nice to have him off of Twitter, from just a day-to-day standpoint, and the way that he destroys and ruins everything about our politics. It's actually nice to have him.
No, you're right. And you're also getting to a very uncomfortable truth for the libertarians, because they're always like, the secret of bad speech is more speech. And I'm like, yeah, well, the truth is that deplatforming works. I mean, when's the last time you talked about Milo? When's the last time? I mean, there's a lot of the people out there who are basically huge sensations gone the moment they were off Twitter. I think that's a bad thing. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Milo or any of these people, but it doesn't matter, right?
Right.
Because they're the people that basically you can decide whether somebody has a livelihood in the internet or not, basically in the single click of a button. And I'm very uncomfortable with that. And just to bring it full circle, which is all of this around Trump, like the man and himself, this is really starting to bear out in some of the Gallup data that we see. Let's put this up there on the screen, which is party affiliation. This is actually one of the best barometers for how people feel about parties, and specifically going into midterms and other very coincidental elections. And you can see there that Republican affiliation is at one of its lowest levels since 2012. It makes a lot of sense to me because 2012 was the peak of the Paul Ryan era. This is idiocy on another level, which is the lie that the election was stolen. And only about 40% of the public is really like willing to even entertain or affiliate itself with the party, which is basically, surrounding itself and revolving around that idea. And I pointed to this. You can see this also with the idiocy from the Democrats. Trump's greatest gift was Russiagate. January 2019, if we'll put that back up there on the screen, you can actually see how high Republican Party affiliation was. It was at its highest level in almost 2 decades.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because the Democrats, it appeared, didn't stand for anything except being anti-Trump. And look at that. Look at that number in which they converge for the first time since the mid-2010s. That is a reason for what you stand for. And now you can see that the Republicans being back down to 40. The last time they were this low was Iraq. And then the next time was tax cuts, Paul Ryan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And now, this time, it is basically Trump and Stop the Steal and not actually being for anything. Anti-COVID relief, anti-Biden infrastructure plan. What are you for? Nothing. I mean, you just passed this law down in Georgia, which, by the way, is hilarious to me. Trump came out and blasted it as too weak.
Right.
So I saw all these Republicans basically get egg on their... They went to the mat for this thing. They're like, what are you talking about this law? It's going to restore people's trust and all this. And then Trump comes out and basically says, I'm not going to say it, but he said it once they're out on the campaign trail. And now you look like a fool, right? You just went to bat for this thing. This is what he does. He forces you to defend the indefensible and then comes out and says that it's not... It says that it's not enough. And so he has driven Republican Party identification all the way to the bottom. And they have a big problem because at the same time, the most popular man in the Republican Party, the biggest, fundraiser, as we saw from those numbers, it's just a crazy dynamic they've got themselves in.
Escalating loyalty tests, what they do is every time a larger, more audacious, more outrageous loyalty test comes into play, which is basically Stop the Steal was like the piece de resistance, right?
Yeah,
it was like the ultimate loyalty test.
Yeah.
They shave off a certain percent, and the ones that are willing to go along with it become even more hardened in their support. And that's basically the dynamic of the Trump presidency and the Trump era writ large. It really starts with the grab him by the P word tape. That was the first time, I shouldn't say the first, but that was one of the main sort of loyalty tests going into that election. The people, it maybe shaved off a little bit of support, but the people who were with him, they were all the way in because they'd had to justify to themselves and their friends and their family these outrageous positions that they were taking. And Stop the Steal was the ultimate loyalty test. And so, you have this very hardened core of support, but it becomes increasingly isolated from the rest of the population. Right. And over time, as it gets whittled down and whittled down and whittled down, little by little, these are not huge, massive shifts. It becomes more and more difficult to have any sort of governing majority, even with the rigging of the system that Republicans benefit from. Electorally, they just have an advantage because of the way that the system is set up. I do want to say on those Gallup numbers, which is important, you shouldn't take away from this that people are like loving the Democrats, because actually all of the growth, that chart that we showed you, and we can put that back up on the screen, that chart that we showed you, that's with the Democrats and the Democratic-leaning independents and the Republicans and the Republican-leaning independents. If you separate out the independents, that's actually the group that is growing. So Democrats and Republicans, like the hard partisan affiliation, is not really changing much. The thing that's increasing is the number of independents, which maybe is actually a positive sign. Yeah, I think it's very interesting to me to see all of it go that way. And I think people were incredibly disillusioned and upset to the 2020 election, regardless of really whichever side you voted for, even if you didn't vote and more. It was shameful in terms of just how it was conducted, the way it all went about, how terrible of a year it is. And people really do realize that we need something new. Now, whether that emerges, I have no idea. There you go. All right, we're going to tell you it's on our radar, so that's next.